Hey all, this is different from my usual content, but I wanted to show people at my university how to connect Skytap and Azure together since it's a complicated task, and I wanted to make it easy for them and anyone else out there searching for the solution, since there's virtually no information on it. In this video, I'll show you step by step how to connect the Skytap environment to the Azure environment through a VPN gateway in Azure, and then join the Azure server to the Skytap domain. Communications are also secured via Ipsec. Both of these tasks are worth a lot of points for our school project. I tried to make it as easy as possible. To do this, you'll already have to have a domain controller in Forest set up in Skytap. I'll show you how it's done with fresh new servers so you can follow along and do it with your own Skytap and Azure environment. Okay, so this is a basic Skytap environment with a server that's already promoted to a domain controller with the domain testdomain.com. You should already have your own Windows 2019 or 2016 server promoted to a domain controller too for your project with its own domain and Forest. You first need to give it a public IP though through network settings and VM settings. Your server will also have a private IP and its own private network, which you'll use later to set the connection. Next, you need to sign up for Azure with a bank card, and they do charge money to use their services, but it's pay as you go, and it's not very much if you do basic stuff in a short window of time, and you can monitor your current and projected costs right here so it doesn't get out of control. So basically, Azure lets you build each part of your network individually, including servers and gateways, and they're referred to as resources. It's really different from Skytap. For the connection, we're going to build in Azure the following: a virtual network with its own address space and a default subnet and gateway subnet, a virtual Windows Server 2019 machine in that default subnet, and this will be our second domain controller for the project. We'll also build a virtual gateway in the gateway subnet that also has a public IP that Skytap connects to. And we'll also build a local gateway, which represents the Skytap environment and defines the IP address over there. And we'll create a connection resource, which has the settings and pre-shared key for our connection between Skytap and Azure. If it seems really complicated, don't worry, I'll show you how it's all done, and it should make sense in the end. Now, you first need to create a virtual network in Azure. You have to choose a resource group, and they should give you one by default, or you can make a new one. The resource group just helps you keep track of your resources, and I use the same one every time when they ask for it. Now you have to name your virtual network. This is my third one, so I'll call it VNet3, but you can call yours whatever you want. I'm going to give it a very different IP address from the 10.0.0.0 since that's too similar to the Skytap address space. So we'll delete the 10.0.0.0.1 and give it a new one. You also need to add one default subnet where your virtual server will reside. Your virtual server should have its own private IP address within this subnet. I'm going to subnet it down to .20/24. Azure can be really slow sometimes, so you have to wait a while on stuff. Once it's complete, we can add a virtual server machine. As you can see, I already have 2 servers already, and they're in other networks. We'll add a third one for this third network we just created. you can use the same settings that I use. Now we have to add a username and a password. You can't use administrator right here, so just write your own username and password down. Since you'll need these later to log into the server through RDP, it's not exactly like Skytap. Now, you might have to make a new storage account for this setting. I just put in random numbers and used that, and it made a storage account for me, and you can just use that every time for your resources. Once our virtual machine is up, we can set a static IP for later. The server will be on for right now and running, but we'll log into it in a few minutes at the end of this tutorial to add it to the Skytap domain. And it will be our second domain controller for the Skytap domain, testdomain.com. We want to set up a virtual gateway next, and we need to make a subnet for it first. So we go to our virtual network and subnets, and we simply click on Gateway Subnet. It'll be a /28. And now we need to build a virtual network gateway. As you can see, I already have two, so we'll add a third one and name it VNGate3. Again, you can use my same settings and name it whatever you want. Make sure the SKU is basic, and also make sure it's in the virtual network you created earlier. You have to also name the public IP, which is really important for the connection later on. Now, a virtual network gateway does take a really long time to create, so you might have to wait a half an hour or more. Now we're almost done, and we can add a local gateway that represents where your Skytap environment is, including the public IP address of our server in Skytap. Make sure you give it the public IP of your Skytap server. This is really important for the connection. Your public IP address though will be different than the one I'm using here. Then under address space, we need a sort of static route for the private address space of Skytap. So in this case, it's 10.000/24. Lastly, we have to put in the connection resource for Azure to Skytap. We can set it in the VN gate settings. And we want to name it, since this is going to be our third connection, we'll name it this. And we specify it's using the local gateway, which matches the Skytap domain IP address, and also the virtual network gateway that we created earlier. This way it knows what public IP addresses to link together. And it needs a share key, which will simply make password. Now over here in Skytap, we need to add the remote access role and these role services to our Skytap server, and you'll need to do this too with whatever domain controller you're using. Now we go to routing and remote access and activate it. Secure connection between the two private networks. We want to demand dial and automatically connect. Now we name the interface or connection on this side in Skytap. We'll name it Azure Connection 3 since this is my third connection in Skytap to Azure, but you can name it whatever you want. We're using VPN and this setting. Now we need the destination address. That is the public IP of the virtual network gateway in Azure, and which you can get this way over in your Azure settings. We want to route packets, and now we want the static route of the private address space in our Azure virtual network. That would be the 172.48.00/16, which we first created in VNet 3 earlier in the video. Metric is set at 10. And now we need to set a static route again over here. I don't know why, but you need to do it twice in this particular service. And we're using the same address before from our virtual network in Azure. And now we have Azure Connection 3 here with the static routes we want and the destination address being the public IP of the virtual gateway in Azure. It's demand dial, which we never want to hang up. And it needs the pre-shared key, which we set earlier in Azure, and that was just password. In real life though, you'd obviously want something more complicated. And now we just need to right-click and choose Connect to establish a connection between the Skytap server and the virtual network gateway in Azure. But if you can't connect, I think it would be a good idea to ping both the public and private addresses from each server and turn off the firewalls so nothing is blocking their connection for now. Or leave them on and open the ports that you need. And if you still can't make a connection to the virtual network gateway, see the end of the video and I'll try to provide some extra help. We can log into the Azure server, which has been running this whole time. We are going to use the RDP. You can just download it from the connection here and click on it in your downloads folder. Then log into it with the credentials you set way earlier in the video when you first made the virtual machine. So if you remember, I just used the name Carl. So as you can see, even though we have a connection to the gateway, we can't ping the Azure server. So to make it easy on ourselves, let's log into the Azure server and turn off the firewalls temporarily, and then try to add it to the Skytap domain. Now, since this is a new server, I'm going to install the Active Directory role since we want to upgrade it to be our second domain controller. Now, before we join the Azure server to the Skytap domain, I need to point it at the Skytap server through preferred DNS server here. We're going to use the private address from Skytap. This will cause our Azure server to log off for a few minutes, but we should be able to log on to it later. While you're waiting, you can always test connectivity to the server on the Azure site, like I did here. And if you still can't log into it again, try to restart the server on the Azure site and download a new RDP if you need to and log in again. Okay, since we restarted it, we can log into the Azure server again, and now finally we can join it to the Skytap domain. Of course, your domain name will be different. Mine is just testdomain.com for this particular example. Now the machine will restart. You'll have to wait on it again, and this time when you try to log into it, you'll need to log into it with your Skytap domain credentials, which are going to be different probably from your Azure credentials. It's now a part of the Skytap domain and needs a different user account and password to log in. It's probably going to be administrator though, if that's what you used to join it to the domain, as I did in the example earlier. As you can see, the Azure server is now part of the Skytap server's domain, testdomain.com. So the connection has been established between Azure and Skytap. We're using Ipsec, and Azure server is the second domain controller for our Skytap test domain. Now, obviously, in a real work environment, we'd probably want more secure settings, and maybe wouldn't even do all this, but for demonstration purposes, this is pretty cool, and it works for our project. If you need any extra help I would suggest just to start all over again and delete all your Azure resources and start fresh from the beginning and try to use the same settings that I use since I know they work. And also I mapped out my own project so I could double check to make sure all my settings were correct. You can do the same thing as I did here and try to make sure that your settings are similar. The only difference being that you're going to have different public IP addresses which are above each object here in my network map.